The police officer looked at the old woman standing on the porch, then back at the terrified couple in the driveway. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "you're telling me this house belongs to the HOA?" "Yes," the woman snapped. "And these people are trespassing." The officer frowned, because the man she was pointing at wasn't a stranger. His name was clearly printed on the property deed in the officer's hand. And somehow, the 72-year-old HOA president had changed the locks on a home she didn't own. When Daniel Mercer pulled into his neighborhood after spending 2 weeks at his brother's funeral in Texas, he immediately knew something was wrong. The lights inside his home were on. At first, he thought maybe his daughter had stopped by to check the place. But then he noticed the flower beds were ripped out. The American flag his late father had hung beside the garage was gone, and the front door had a brand new lock. His wife, Ellen, stared at the house in confusion. "Daniel," she whispered, "why does it look like someone moved in?" Before Daniel could answer, the front door swung open. Out walked Judith Harper, president of the Willow Creek HOA. 70 years old, always dressed like she was running for mayor. Pink blazer, perfect blonde hair, permanence code, and she was holding Daniel's spare key. "Oh good," Judith said casually. "You finally came back." Daniel blinked. "Why are you inside my house?" Judith crossed her arms. "Actually, this property now falls under HOA possession due to abandonment violations." Ellen let out a nervous laugh. "What? You were gone for too long," Judith replied. The grass exceeded HOA standards. Mail overflowed. The board voted to secure the property. Daniel stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Secure the property?" he repeated. "You changed my locks." Judith's smile tightened. "You should have read the HOA agreement more carefully." Daniel had lived in that neighborhood for 18 years. He had paid every HOA fee on time. He had never missed a property tax payment. And now this woman was standing in his doorway, pretending she owned his home. Things got worse when Daniel tried his key. It didn't work. Judith had really locked them out. Ellen's face turned pale. "Our medications are inside." Judith shrugged. "That's not my concern." At that moment, Daniel realized this wasn't just another HOA argument. Something was seriously wrong with this woman. Within minutes, neighbors started gathering outside. Most stayed quiet. Nobody wanted problems with Judith. The entire neighborhood knew how powerful she'd become over the years. She fined people over trash cans, curtains, even Christmas decorations. One older neighbor quietly walked over to Daniel. "Call the police," he whispered. "She's been saying for months she wanted your property." Daniel frowned. "What?" The neighbor glanced nervously toward Judith. "She's been trying to buy homes around the lake entrance. Your house is the last one she needs." Suddenly, everything clicked. Daniel's property sat on the corner lot near the entrance fountain. It was one of the biggest lots in Willow Creek, and Judith wanted it, not for the HOA, for herself. When the police arrived, Judith acted completely calm. She handed the officers a thick folder full of HOA paperwork. "Mr. Mercer violated community abandonment policies," she explained confidently. "The board granted temporary possession rights." One officer flipped through the pages. The other looked confused. "Temporary possession?" he asked. "That's not ownership." Judith smiled thinly. "The property was neglected." Daniel finally snapped. "My brother died," he shouted. "I was burying family." The street went silent. Even the officers looked uncomfortable. But Judith didn't care. "You still violated HOA standards," she replied coldly. Ellen started crying quietly beside the car. And for the first time in 18 years, Daniel felt humiliated standing in front of his own home. Then, one of the officers asked the question that changed everything. "Ma'am, why were the locks changed before any court order?" Judith's expression shifted for half a second. Just enough. The officer noticed. "So there was no judge involved?" he pressed. Judith adjusted her blazer. "The HOA acted within community authority." The officer slowly closed the folder. "That's not how property law works." Judith's confidence finally cracked. "But, no," the officer interrupted. "You cannot see someone's home because their grass got tall." A few neighbors started whispering. Another pulled out a phone and began recording. Judith suddenly realized the entire neighborhood was turning against her. But then Daniel made a discovery that stunned everyone. One of the downstairs windows was slightly open, and inside the living room, someone was moving around. Daniel froze, because Judith had told police the house was secured and empty. So who was inside his home? Daniel moved toward the window before the officers could stop him. Inside the living room, a man in work boots was carrying one of Ellen's family photo boxes toward the kitchen. "What the hell is going on?" Daniel shouted. The man nearly dropped the box. Suddenly, Judith rushed forward. "He's with the HOA maintenance team," she snapped. But nobody believed her anymore, because the man wasn't cleaning. He was packing. One officer immediately stepped inside through the unlocked back door, while the second officer held Judith outside. Within seconds, the officer's voice echoed through the house. "Sir, you need to step away from those items." Daniel followed behind him and stopped cold. Half the house had already been emptied. Family photographs were stacked near the hallway. Kitchen drawers sat open. Their television was disconnected. And Judith's so-called maintenance worker had packing tape and moving boxes spread across the floor. Ellen covered her mouth in shock. "She was stealing from us." The officer turned toward Judith. "Ma'am, do you want to explain this?" Judith's face went pale. "You don't understand," she stammered. "The board approved preparations." "No board approved theft," the officer replied sharply. Outside, neighbors had fully gathered by now. Phones were recording from every angle. And for the first time in years, nobody looked afraid of Judith Harper anymore. One neighbor finally spoke up. She did this before. The crowd turned. An older veteran named Carl stepped forward slowly. "She threatened my wife after we refused to sell our lot 3 years ago." Another neighbor joined in. "She fined us every week until we moved." Then another, and another. Years of anger suddenly exploded into the open. Judith had ruled the neighborhood through intimidation for so long that people forgot they could simply say no. Daniel stood silently in the middle of his destroyed living room while the truth unraveled around him. This had never been about HOA rules. Judith wanted his property because a real estate developer had been negotiating with the neighborhood for months. Daniel's corner lot was the final piece. If she controlled it, the entrance expansion project would move forward. And according to Carl, Judith's son worked for the development company. That's when one officer asked the question nobody expected. Did the HOA board actually approve any of this? Judith hesitated too long. The officer nodded slowly. "I'll take that as a no." 3 days later, the story spread across local news. HOA president accused of illegally taking home. Residents across the county flooded social media with their own HOA horror stories. But Willow Creek became the worst example, because investigators discovered Judith had been issuing fake violation notices for years. Most people simply paid them out of fear. Others moved away, and nobody had challenged her until Daniel came home unexpectedly. The real shock came during the emergency HOA meeting. Nearly every resident showed up. Judith walked in wearing the same pink blazer she always wore, but this time nobody looked intimidated. Not even a little. The meeting lasted less than 20 minutes. She was removed immediately. Then the neighborhood voted to dissolve several abusive HOA policies she personally created. When Judith finally stood up to leave, the room stayed silent. No applause, no sympathy, just silence. Because everyone knew she had destroyed her own reputation chasing power she never legally had. A month later, Daniel rehung his father's American flag beside the garage. The flower beds were repaired. The locks were replaced. And for the first time in weeks, the house finally felt peaceful again. One evening, Carl walked over while Daniel watered the lawn. "You know," Carl said quietly, "most people would have sold after what she did." Daniel looked at his home. The porch his father built. The tree Ellen planted 20 years ago. The driveway where his daughter learned to ride a bike. "This house isn't just property," Daniel replied. "It's our life." Carl nodded slowly. Then he glanced toward Judith's empty home at the end of the street. A for sale sign stood in the yard. Nobody said a word for a moment. Finally, Carl smirked. "Kind of funny, isn't it?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "The woman who tried stealing everyone's homes," Carl said, "ended up losing her own." and for the first time since returning from Texas. Daniel laughed.